When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Commons YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about why I think The Winds of Winter is taking longer, not just from the perspective of George, where I feel like he doesn't really want to finish the story anymore, but we're going to be looking at it more from a narrative point of view. Why, at this point, it's harder to finish a book than it was, say, in A Clash of Kings or Storm of Swords. Why now is it taking a lot longer than those other books, just from a narrative point of view? So in this video, I'm not going to really be talking about George R.R. Martin and how he himself is not wanting to do this, but I'm going to be talking about just narratively why it is harder. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow. Make sure people like this content as well. And let's get into the video. So to kind of figure this one out, I want to start with the first three books, because you're going to see some parallels from the first three books to thematically the last three books, or I guess the last four books. But for me, I kind of count Feast for Crows and Dance as one book, because in reality, they're just one big book. Both those events are happening around the same time in those books. And it was just the book was too big, so he had to split it up into two. So narratively, if we look at the first book was your introduction into the story. It was kind of figuring out what's going on, kind of the themes of the book, and a lot of that kind of stuff. Had a lot of, payoffs like Ned's death and stuff like that, but it was more or less setting up the next two books. Now, if we look at A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, because I always say the climax and or the middle point of the books is going to be A Storm of Swords. It's going to be the middle book of the entire series, really, and it has the most big payoffs. It has the most big moments of all the books, in my opinion. And when you look at it from this point of view of Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, it's kind of the settling down of that, where I have a lot of ruling in those two books. It's not a lot of big payoffs. It's a lot of kind of setup and making Winds of Winter a lot more intriguing, right? We have, by the end of those books, we have so many kind of issues coming to a forefront. Why, Aegon's coming over, Dany's probably going to be coming over in the next book, Jon is dead, all that stuff. It's leading into the big payoffs that are going to happen in the next two books. So that's kind of how I look at Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons. I would compare it very much to the first book, A Game of Thrones, where they have their moments, but they are realistically set up books for the next two books. Now, if you look at A Clash of Kings, you have a lot of good moments in there, but you also have some more setup. So that book is a mixture, right? Because you're paying a lot of things off from the first book, but you're also building a lot more things for the third book, like the Red Wedding, like the Purple Wedding, like, Tyrion, where people don't like him in the third book because of actions he did in the second book. Setting up Jaime and all that stuff. So when I'm looking at it from that point of view, in my opinion, for George, the second book was probably the hardest one to write once he had kind of figured out what he wanted to do in those first three books. Just based upon how much work you had to do in that second book, going for the story and the rest of the story and all that stuff. So when you compare that to Winds, right? Winds of Winter not only has to set up the final book, but it also has to make a bunch of payoffs from the last two books, Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. So it's that weird thing where you have to, A, set up everything for the last book, which is a ton to do in itself, because if you look at the differences between Clash and Winds, Winds has way more plot lines, way more POVs. Everything's just bigger, right? Now, you also have to remember that in those last two books, right, that have been released, Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, they've taken a lot longer, which tells me that George really didn't have the story figured out as much as he did in those first three books. I feel like the first three books was the story he really wanted to tell, and then after that point, he realized how much success these were having and that, he wanted to continue them and do more stuff with them. He just didn't have it all figured out yet. So when it comes to these last, couple books, he's really trying to make the story make sense. He doesn't have that fit story for it yet, in my opinion. And if we compare the last book, right, so Storm of Swords to Dream of Spring, I feel like that was probably the easiest book George had to make, was A Storm of Swords, just because everything that happens in Storm of Swords had really already been set up in the other two books. There wasn't a lot of setup you needed to do in that book, right? Because that book is constant payoffs, payoff, 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 payoff. And don't get me wrong, he does introduce some setups in that book to, you know, go into other books as well. But that book is mainly focused on paying off the first two books. Now, when you look at A Dream of Spring, that's what Dream of Spring is going to be. Dream of Spring is going to be paying off all the rest of the other books. It doesn't need setup because there's not going to be any other book. So that is why I think if Winds does come out, I think Dream of Spring will come out a lot quicker if it even does. But even if you look at, just take that part out of it. Let's look at Winds of Winter narratively, what has to happen, right? Dany has to, at least by the end of the book, be coming to Westeros and hopefully landed in Dragonstone, maybe that being her last chapter, right? That has to happen. Dany cannot still be in Essos by the end of Winds of Winter and then expect to just bring her. It would feel too forced, in my opinion. So I think Dany has to be over by the end of this book. Jon and everything going on in the north, let's presume Jon is still alive, right? He comes back, let's say he's alive. And you got to pay off, or you got to set up and pay off, who is going to rule the north. You've got to rule how is, Winterfell going to get taken. How are the Boltons going down? Who is going to be in charge? What's Rickon's involvement in this? What's going to happen with Bran north of the wall when all that comes? How are the others going to get through the wall? What's up with Euron? What's up with everybody else that's with Daenerys? Because there's so many different characters over there. With Victarion, is Barristan going to live? You have so much going on, and that's not even half of it, of what I just talked about. That narratively, trying to put all of that into one book is going to be very difficult for George, right? And I think that's one of the big reasons why George is struggling to write this book, alongside of outside factors that I've talked about in other videos. And when you look at it from that point of view, you kind of understand maybe why it's taking so long, even though I still believe it probably should have been released by now. But I think George got distracted and also is kind of daunted by the task of finishing it. That is kind of what I wanted to talk about in this video. Why Winds just... It's hard for George to write in general, and it would be hard for kind of anyone to write. But it's something that does need to be done, I feel like. But yeah, so thank you guys all for watching this video. A little bit shorter. I just wanted to talk about kind of the problems of Winds and the problems of making a bunch of more like POV characters in Feast and Dance, and then the problems you're going to have when writing the next book, just because of how big you've now made the world even more than it already was. So thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.